today on our phase 2 trial of inhaled interferon beta, which is being given to SARS-CoV-2 positive patients in the home and in the hospital environment. I'm joined by Professor Nick Francis, who led the research in the home environment, and Professor Tom Wilkinson, who led the research in the hospital environment and is the chief investigator for the trial overall. Both are from the University of Southampton. A little bit of background. Interferon beta is a very important protein that drives our innate immune responses. This is our first line of defense against viral infection. We've noticed historically that some patients have a sluggish or a poor interferon beta response during viral infections, and this seems to make them vulnerable to viral infections. On top of that, the SARS-CoV-2 virus suppresses interferon beta. So if you are vulnerable already because you don't make enough interferon beta, and then you bump into a virus that suppresses interferon beta production, then there seems to be a likelihood that you will end up in hospital in need of treatment. Our formulation, SNG001, contains interferon beta. It's been formulated to be pH neutral and to minimize the inclusion of excipients which could aggravate the airways. The drug is delivered by a mesh nebulizer, which is very efficient and gentle with the protein, and manufactured to scale. We've done some previous clinical trials, mainly in asthma and COPD patients, which has shown the drug is well tolerated. We've also demonstrated a boosting of the innate immune responses in lungs using biomarkers, and we've had benefits in lung function from those previous trials. Last year, we completed the hospitalized cohort in this trial and published data in a press release in July, and also in the Lancet Respiratory Medicine, which was published in November. The data from that trial triggered a phase 3 trial, which started in January. It's international, it's progressing well, and is scheduled to report in the second half of this year. This slide shows that both interferon alpha, a cousin of interferon beta, and interferon beta reduce virus replication in vitro experiments. But the point of this slide is not to show that these drugs are antiviral. The point of this slide is to talk about the levels of drug required to get this antiviral response. And we believe the only way to accomplish these levels in the lining of the lungs is to deliver directly into the airways via a nebulizer. The clinical trial that we started last year involved 100 patients, or 101 patients, who were dosed in the hospital setting and 120 patients who were dosed in the home setting. The data from the 101 patients was reported last year, and we're reporting today on the 120 patients who were dosed in the home setting. All patients were dosed for 14 days. The ordinal scale, or the OSCE scale, produced by the WHO, is very useful as an endpoint, but it also helps set the scene. So the 120 patients dosed in the home setting are either affected by virus and there's a limitation of activities, or there's no limitation of activities. In the hospital environment, we're avoiding ventilated patients, and we're recruiting patients who either do or do not need oxygen, with the objective that we prevent deterioration and we get people back to level 1 on the ordinal scale, which is no limitation of activities, and we define that as recovery. In the hospital setting last year, we produced data that shows that people on drug have an accelerated recovery. They were more than twice as likely to recover on drug compared to placebo. That's the left-hand graph. And the right-hand graph shows that we were able to reduce a core symptom of COVID-19, which is breathlessness. We also saw some very encouraging data suggesting we may have reduced the odds of development of severe disease and death. I'm now going to hand over to Nick Francis, who will give you an update on our findings from the home treated patients.
Okay, so thank you, Richard. My name is Professor Nick Francis, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study. So this cohort included 120 patients who had proven SARS-CoV-2 infection and COVID-19 illness. They had to be symptomatic, but they were at home and ambulatory. And these, just to remind you, were patients who were at risk, so they were over 65 or over 50 with other risk factors. And the main aim of this study was to see whether giving this drug, SNG001, early to these patients could help to prevent them from getting worse, from deteriorating, from progressing to having severe respiratory illness. Of course, the secondary aim was to actually see whether we could help them to recover more quickly. By recovery, we mean getting back to the point where they had no limitation of activities, or where they were at level 1 on the OSCE score. So, what did we show? Well, in terms of the initial endpoint, preventing deterioration, only 2 of the patients in the whole cohort actually deteriorated to level 3 or above, in other words, to hospitalization or worse. Both of these patients were on placebo, but obviously there's not much we can do statistically with that data. So the hospitalization rate in the placebo arm was about 3%, and this is in line with findings from other trials in at-risk non-hospitalized patients. So we think it's a fairly representative cohort, but not what we'd anticipated when we were setting up the study. In terms of accelerating recovery, so getting back to level 1, as you can see from this graph, there was no difference between the 2 arms of the study in terms of the time to getting back to level 1. But I should point out that 39% of the participants already started off at level 1, where they had no limitation of activities. So there wasn't really a lot of scope for these people to show improvement. So moving on to the next slide. So we then considered whether there were other important outcomes. We measured a whole range of symptoms like cough and breathlessness, headache, myalgias, fatigue, and we added all these up as a total symptom score and looked at the difference in that. And as you can see on the graph on the left here, 2 things to note. The first is that actually the overall burden of symptom score was low. These patients largely had mild illness with very few symptoms. And the second is that there was no significant difference between the 2 groups in total symptom score. Now, this is not what we expected when we first set out to do this study, recruiting an at-risk population. We anticipated that there would be more severe symptom burden in this population. This drug, SNG-001, is targeted at the lungs, and so we were particularly interested in breathlessness. So we focused in on the breathlessness score, and what you can see here is that the majority of patients have mild breathlessness at the onset. There was a slight improvement in breathlessness overall over the course of the follow-up, with no marked difference between groups. So this led us scratching our heads a little bit and wondering whether there were perhaps important subgroups that might be benefiting more than others. And again, it's a lung drug, and so we're particularly interested in breathlessness, and we decided to focus in on those patients who were more breathless at recruitment, at the start of treatment. So in the first graph here, we've got participants who scored 2 or more on the breathlessness scale. That's moderate breathlessness which is noticeable when performing light activities. And as you can see, there appears to be something happening here in terms of time to recovery, or getting back to the OSCE score of 1 with no limitation of activities. With a separation between the 2 lines here, showing a potential treatment effect for SNG-001. But these are small numbers. This is less than 25% of the total population. When you look at the graph on the right, these are the participants who had marked breathlessness, the breathlessness that was noticeable when washing or dressing, for example. And this is an even smaller cohort with just 11% of the population. But there's certainly more of a suggestion of something going on here. And this is looking at that data again, actually looking at breathlessness over the follow-up period in the two groups. And this is the patients who started off with marked or severe breathlessness. The blue bars here are less breathless, the red bars more breathlessness. And you can see that there's a suggestion of something happening here. But again, these are small numbers of participants. So in summary, only 2 patients deteriorated on the ordinal scale in this study, so we weren't really to make any definitive conclusions on our primary endpoint. Both of these were in the placebo arm though. In general, we found that most patients in the community with SARS-CoV-2, even though these were at-risk patients, most of them had mild symptoms, including breathlessness. We found that in patients who were breathless at the start of the treatment, there was a similar pattern in recovery to those who were in the hospital cohort, so those who had more severe breathlessness and were admitted to hospital. So a similar sort of pattern of recovery to back to no limitation of activities. We also showed that we were able to deliver this study, that we were able to treat breathless patients at home in this study. And we've been collecting data on long COVID, so people who've got prolonged symptoms, and we're expecting to produce those results in the summer of 2021. So overall, these data make us wonder whether we should actually be selecting patients based on their initial breathlessness. There definitely appears to be a difference in the illness trajectory for those patients who are more breathless, and certainly a suggestion that these patients may be benefiting more from SNG-001.
Thanks very much for that. So looking at the results of the home study, we saw this very important signal that patients that were experiencing breathlessness from COVID-19 were possibly the cohort that would benefit most from interferon beta therapy. So this led us to look at the wider population of both the hospital and the home cohort, and to combine these data and see if we saw a similar signal in which breathlessness was really driving this response across those two populations. And if we look on this slide, we can see that there is a clear signal here. If we combine the analysis for the hospital and home cohorts, we can see that there's clear separation in the rate of recovery in the placebo patients only, dependent on the initial degree of breathlessness at presentation, with patients with no breathlessness recovering rapidly and the majority improving by day 15, where patients who had more severe, marked or severe breathlessness really were not recovering as rapidly, and these are the most vulnerable patient population that one would hypothesize would benefit most from treatment. And so if we extend the analysis of the combined data set, looking at the treatment effect of SNG-001, stratifying the population by breathlessness, here we see a clear signal of benefit in this discrete population. So this slide shows that analysis. On the left we have a combined analysis set stratified for patients who had less significant breathlessness, less than 3 on the scale, and we look at recovery, and there was no clear overall benefit of treatment in that population. However, if we take the breathless cohort with breathlessness score of 3 or above, we can see very clearly that there's a separation between the treatment arm and the placebo arm in terms of recovery. We have a hazard ratio of over 3 for recovery on the ordinal scale, and we feel this is a very important conclusion. Understanding which group of patients are most likely to benefit from this treatment allows us to target this therapy, whether it be in a home or hospital setting, to the patients that are most likely to require its effects. If we look therefore overall at the trial, at a number of analyses of outcome looking at the WHO scale, we can see that in all groups, whether they be defined by breathlessness alone in any setting, or in hospitalised breathless patients, or in patients that are breathless and require oxygen, there's a clear benefit of treatment. However, breathlessness seems to be the most useful indicator in identifying this responder group. And this is really important in the current context of COVID management, with new models of care evolving, integrated care services managing patients at home, home ward environments to manage people who do not require hospitalisation but may need some respiratory support. We need to understand which patients are going to require an intervention such as this, and we feel these data point us in the right direction and will help target the right patient population who will respond most powerfully to this new treatment. So on this slide we really summarise all the analysis, both from the original hospitalised patient study published in the Lancet Respiratory Medicine, and then the extended analysis of the hospital and home studies using breathlessness as a stratification tool. So the top two lines there identify that in the hospitalised cohort there was a clear benefit of treatment in patients that were hospitalised with COVID, and that there was a more powerful signal in the patients requiring oxygen. If we look in the extended analysis, we identify the responder population, patients with breathlessness with a score of 3 or 4, a hazard ratio there of 3.41 in benefit of treatment. But we also importantly identify the population who are not breathless and who do not demonstrably benefit from treatment. And it's really important in the current global crisis of COVID that we know which patients are most likely to respond to a specific therapy and which patients, i.e. the non-breathless ones, who don't require that intervention and can be left to a standard care. If we look at the additional analysis in the hospitalised patients who are also breathless, we see a clear signal of benefit. And if we look at patients who are both oxygen dependent and breathless, again this confirms our finding that this is an important indicator of response to therapy.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Nick. This has been a very valuable exercise for us. We have learnt a lot through dosing 120 patients in the home environment, and we've learnt that despite risk factors, the chance of developing severe lower respiratory tract illness is surprisingly low, much lower than we had imagined it would be when the trial was conceived last year. But from that exercise, we were able to identify breathlessness as a very important symptom that one might want to consider when selecting patients for treatment. And applying that breathlessness factor to the combined hospital and home cohort, we see a strong signal in respect of accelerating the recovery to no limitation of activities on the WHO ordinal scale. And we're very pleased that last year, based on the findings from the hospital cohort, we had gravitated towards the most breathless patients, and these are the ones who need oxygen as part of their standard of care in the hospital environment. And we're very pleased to have started the phase 3 trial focusing on those patients in January this year. That trial is progressing well, and we expect data in the second half of this year.
And all of the work we've done wouldn't be possible without a huge team of people. So we've got a team of people to mention for the hospital study, the home study, and people who worked across all of the studies. I think it's best to move towards questions and hopefully we can provide some answers.
Thank you. Your question and answer session will now begin. If you wish to ask an audio question, please key star then 1 on your telephone. If you then decide to withdraw that question, simply key *2. Alternatively, you may submit your question on the webcast page using the Ask a Question button. So just a reminder, *1 on your telephone for an audio question, or use the Ask a Question button on the webcast page. We have our first audio question, and that is coming from the line of Paul Cudden from Numis. Go ahead, your line is open.
Good morning, guys, and thank you very much for taking my questions, and congratulations on the data for the more severe patients this morning. Firstly, perhaps one for Nick. What percentage of patients were you expecting to require hospitalisation in your sort of early kind of powering calculations for this study? I've then got two more, so I'll sort of wait with that one first.
Well, I think we were setting the study up last sort of April, May, and I think around that time we were thinking that the at-risk population was likely to have an admission rate of in the sort of 10 to 20% range. So yes, 3% is less than we were anticipating at that time.
Okay, and then as we sort of think through the vaccine rollout and variants, there obviously has been some very strong efficacy claims over reduction in hospitalisation with kind of all the vaccines after one dose. So as we kind of look through to next winter, I mean, do you think that there'll be a change in sort of approach to prepare for potential at-home patients with breathlessness?
I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think we need to hope for the best but prepare for the worst. With the new variants and the sort of constantly evolving situation, I think it's I feel that there are going to be there is going to be a need for treating patients. I think vaccines are incredibly useful, but we're not going to be able to control this disease just with vaccines. So I think it's really important that we have effective treatments for patients that are developing disease still. And yes, a lot of those patients will be managed in the home environment. It's really useful to have the hospitals there as a backup, supportive treatment. But a lot of patients do need to be managed in the home environment, especially in these high incidence situations, where we get these waves of illness.
Thank you very much. And perhaps one more for Professor Wilkinson, please. The degree of breathlessness in the kind of hospitalised study, not all patients in the original study were kind of 3 and 4 on the breathlessness scale. So how confident can we be that the oxygen inclusion criteria is going to kind of encompass and enrich for the patients that sort of have more severe breathlessness symptoms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are very similar parallels between an oxygen requiring population and a breathless population, but they're not exactly the same group. Looking at the data from this study and from larger studies of many hundreds of patients requiring treatment in hospital, there is a very significant overlap, however. So if you're in hospital requiring oxygen, you're very much likely to be breathless and vice versa, and there's slight outliers in each population. There's this very interesting group of patients who are profoundly hypoxic but don't experience significant breathlessness or dyspnea, and that's a phenomenon that's being studied at the moment. So in terms of a straightforward criteria for the phase 3 study, we feel confident that it is enriching the population of inclusion for this phenomenon, for this likely responder group, and feel that these data actually reinforce that as a choice of inclusion criteria.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll probably jump back in the queue.
Thank you. The next question is coming from Max Herman from Stifel. Go ahead, your line is open.
Great, thanks very much for taking my questions, and congratulations on completion of this at-home study. 3 questions, if I may. Firstly, just I wondered, in the combined analysis, I don't know if I just missed it from the slides, but how much of the, I think it was 69 patients who had the highest breathless score that were included in the subgroup analysis, how many of those came from the hospital groups? I'm just trying to understand how much of the power came from the hospital cohort. I'll follow back with the other 2 questions.
I can take that one. So the majority were in the hospital setting. I can't give the exact percentage, but my sort of mental calculation would have it that about 20% were home and 80% were from the hospital cohorts. And I think it's interesting, just picking up on what Tom just said, that some people who were taking oxygen in the hospital setting in the data that we reported last year weren't showing strong signs of breathlessness. And similarly, some patients who were not taking oxygen didn't have high levels of breathlessness. So there'll be some interesting reasons for that. But those patients were dosed in April, May last year. And I think, in the 12 months that have now lapsed, the protocols for choosing people to go into hospital and giving them oxygen would have been tightened up because of the knowledge we now have.
Second question, and maybe third as well, because it's more of a conceptual one, but obviously given the monoclonal antibodies being used in the hospital, in the home setting to avoid hospitalization with at-risk patients, what lessons can be learned from them? Because clearly, whilst I'm not intimate with the knowledge, but they have successfully demonstrated a benefit on hospitalization. So they haven't had this selection, doesn't seem to be having the same selection problem that you had. I don't know if that's just a pure numbers thing, and they've just recruited so many patients that they've overcome that low rate, or whether there's something you could learn from that in terms of the selection. And my final question was just, we see awful pictures in India of patients who are clearly having breathless issues, but can't receive hospital care. Is there a potential to have SNG-001 studied in one of the current settings at the moment that's really horrendous life loss being seen on television on a daily basis?
Yeah, Tom, do you want to take the first question, which I think was around the efficacy of the antibody therapies, which there have been a few trials which have reported now with quite low rates of hospitalization in placebo patients of around 3 or 4% in one of the largest trials, with an effective drug around, I think, bringing it down to 1 to 2%. But Tom, do you want to comment on and perhaps expand the answer and where this drug fits in and ease of use and administration and rollout potentially?
So I think there is a positive signal from the home setting monoclonal antibody intervention studies, and there isn't a selection based on a particular symptom profile, as you suggest in the question, but those were powered to look at an overall response in the entire population. And obviously in our phase 2 study, we didn't have that statistical power, considering the relative low rate of deterioration and hospitalization in our group. So if you wanted a similar size study design, you may well see that effect in an overall population. But considering the enormous resource requirement of giving a monoclonal antibody in a home setting to everybody with COVID, that's not a sustainable clinical model as we stand it, certainly not on a global scale. So we need to understand 2 things. What are the range of treatment options we can give people that have the minimum service requirement? And obviously inhaled therapy that the patient can give themselves at home has particular advantages. And secondly, to understand that not everyone who has a positive COVID test requires a complex intervention, whether it be an antibody or another treatment. So offering a stratification opportunity really does, I think, add to the value of this treatment. And also, this isn't something that requires a very sophisticated or expensive test. It's a simple series of questions around symptomology. So I think that's probably where the differentiator sits at the moment for this therapy.
Can I just follow that up then? Are you saying, because I haven't looked at the data on those studies, that they were also, because I know they were looking at high-risk patients at high risk of being hospitalised, were they just, therefore, did they have similar 3% type incidence rates in their placebo arms of people being hospitalised, and it's purely about how they powered those studies by putting a lot more patients through?
Right. I mean, the studies, the larger phase 3 studies obviously had hundreds and hundreds of patients within them. Some of those studies had very similar placebo admission rates to our own, and the effect size of drug was moderate but powered appropriate in those studies to show significant impact. Obviously, the admission rate to hospital varies enormously in the setting with a country of origin of the patient population, the wave, and now more recently the different variant strains. So this will fluctuate, but I think there is a similar rate in the placebo arm, is the question.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the Regeneron trial, I think that's the one that's published the largest data set, and roughly speaking, 3 to 4% of the placebo patients were hospitalized, and one approaching 2% of the patients who received the antibody were hospitalized. So they can talk about a really good reduction, but the incidence of the event happening, or the chance of the events happening, is relatively low. But that's very impactful. If you apply a small percentage to millions of people, then you are going to reduce the number of patients going to hospital. So that's, giving everyone who is SARS-CoV-2 positive an antibody, if that can be done, makes sense, because you'll relieve an awful lot of pressure on hospitals. But as Tom said, if that can't be done, then perhaps the better way to approach this would be to stratify based on symptoms. And it's clear from our data set, but also the Lilly data set, the Regeneron data sets, where they've talked about symptoms, that not everybody becomes very ill. And here's a data set from us now, which says that the people who have significant breathlessness should be considered for treatment. And luckily, we zoned in on that population for our phase 3 trial, and we made that decision in the autumn last year, and it's looking like quite a good decision today. We're very interested, though, in talking to people who run platform studies in the non-hospitalized population. So we're already in one of those with Active2 in the US. But there are other platform studies that we would love to have a conversation with them about whether we can pull out the very breathless patients out of hospital. Sorry, not get them out of hospital, but treat the ones who are at home but very breathless and keep them out of hospital. And it might be too late. They might still go to hospital, but we could potentially have an effective drug where they spend less time in hospital and have less time of escalating. So that's a conversation we are now looking forward to having because of the data that we've got from the study.
Thank you.
Okay, you asked a question about India, and obviously it's a country struggling massively, and I'm sure other countries are going to struggle massively in the future. We've got trial sites in India in the phase 3 trial, and I will look to engage with the Indian government and any other government that wants to talk to us about other trial ideas, if they've got platform studies, and also help on the forward ordering side as well.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, guys. impressive.
Thank you. The next question is coming from Brian White of Calvine Partner. Go ahead, Brian, your line is open.
Thank you, and thanks for taking my question. I think you've already answered at least partially what I was going to ask, but certainly I was just quite interested in terms of within the study itself. Did you look at levels of hypoxemia in patients? And I know that's certainly for for non-hospitalised patient population, that's always a bit more challenging. But I was just thinking in terms of, is it worth eliminating that as a potential alternative measure of breathlessness in severely affected, potentially hospitalised patients?
So I can take that question. We did look at so in the home study, all the patients had a pulse oximeter, which arrived with their drug and device pack, but we saw very hardly anyone became hypoxic as measured by the pulse oximeter. So breathlessness seems to be a separate factor, as and Tom and Nick can comment on the clinical relevance of that. But just to answer the question, not many people at all became hypoxic in the home cohort. But Tom and Nick should comment on the clinical significance and meaning of that.
And I think that's important, because some people might think, why are we not admitting patients with more severe breathlessness? But there are patients who are fairly breathless who can still manage in the home environment. Obviously, these patients need more careful monitoring, and as Tom mentioned earlier, in the peaks, we've had these virtual wards or virtual hospitals set up where patients can have regular home saturation monitoring. But there are patients who are experiencing breathlessness who actually can still be managed in the home environment.
Can I just follow up then, just in terms of, you obviously know this far better than I do, but I suspect these pulse oximeters don't work particularly well when people are below 90% saturation levels.
So they're certainly less accurate at that level. That is a point. I think if people are reaching that level of hypoxia, they need to be in a controlled medical environment. Obviously, there's great risk of adverse outcomes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now pass back to Alex to answer webcast questions, and we will come back to the phone lines for further questions if there is time at the end.
Thank you very much. We've had a lot of written questions in from the Q&A, and thank you for those questions. We've had several related to drug safety. Here's one. We can see that the drug helps those who are suffering from breathlessness. As the drug is harmless, does it therefore make sense to give it to all patients as a preventative, regardless of the severity of their disease?
Tom, Nick, do you want to take that question based on the data we've now got?
Yeah, I think before we had this understanding, you might think that would be to the case. And obviously, one is trying to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people in treating COVID. What we're now understanding is that COVID can be a mild infection in very many patients. And whilst they may benefit from a minor alleviation of symptoms, that population with very mild disease don't really warrant an intervention that is as potent as this. And obviously, if there's a limited resource, and with the global theatre we're working in, any intervention, whether it be a vaccine or a treatment, is limited in its availability. Targeting that available resource to the right patient population is actually fundamental. So I think this is encouraging us to think in that way and to try and think about clinical pathways where a treatment such as this can be prioritised to the patients who need it most.
This drug is incredibly well tolerated, but some patients do develop cough, and as a general principle, you don't want to be treating people who are not going to benefit or who are very unlikely to benefit. So I think it is incredibly useful that we are starting to identify those who are more likely to benefit. I think there's still more to be done in understanding how breathlessness interacts with other risk factors like age, and it may be that, you know, as we get more data, we will want to target a slightly wider population. But you know, I don't think that we should be targeting all patients with SARS-CoV-2 infection.
Thank you very much. We've also had lots of questions coming through on scale up. Here's one. Can you please tell us about plans for scale up and providers?
So I'll take that question. So there's two elements to this. There's the device side. So the nebulizer that we're using in the phase 3 trial, and actually we used it in the home cohort. So half the people in the home cohort had the Aerogen Solo Ultra device. So that's already made to scale, and we're working with Aerogen to ensure that in the second half of this year, we are in a position to be able to roll this drug out without any limitation or any compromised availability on the device side. So that's going well. And on the drug product manufacturing, we've got an aim to be able to produce 100,000 treatments per month, and we're validating all of the manufacturing steps that enable us to do that at the moment. And in so doing, we are building inventory as we go along.
Very much. We've also had questions coming through asking for any updates on the phase 3 trial. Can you tell us anything additional at this stage?
No, we're happy to say that the trial is likely to read out in the second half of this year. The trial's going well, and we've now got several countries up and running, and we'll give updates later in the year.
Thank you very much. We've also had several questions on India today, but as we've addressed those in a previous question, I'll now pass back to the operator.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions. The next question is from Paul Cudden of Numis. Go ahead, your line is open.
Hello again. Thank you for taking a further question. I mean, there are more profound implications of this data than just simply the prospects for SNG-001 targeted to more severe patients. And I'm thinking kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions, mass vaccination, etc. How can you help change the public health strategy to take a more targeted approach to kind of managing the most at-risk patient groups?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Thanks. That's what we call a hospital pass in rugby. So I think that's a complicated question. You know, what we're trying to do is really several things at once. We're trying to protect the population of the most vulnerable by reducing transmission of disease. And so that really means maintaining the spacing, the isolation when you have a positive diagnosis. And I think if you asking people to stay at home and not to spread the virus when they do catch it, even in the context of a vaccine, you then need to offer them something else. So I think what we're trying to do is create a clinical pathway where we can offer additional advice. So that would be looking at your symptomology. If it's mild and you don't have significant breathlessness, likelihood you will recover. That needs monitoring closely, and you need to maintain interaction with the health service. But the overarching goal there is to protect yourself and your contacts. If, however, you develop these symptoms of breathlessness, there may be treatment options available that could be given early at home. So there may be a way of intervening earlier than waiting till perhaps you would have done and waited to someone require admission to hospital. So that can build confidence in the clinical pathway, maintain people in an isolated state, and limit the resource requirement eventually on hospital care. And obviously then the treatment can be continued or started in a more an environment of hospital or integrated care.
So I think that's, we have to find ways of actually complementing the best public health messaging and ensuring that patients feel confident to follow that advice. And I think this is where these data are helping in that regard. Obviously, there's a long way to go to slot in very different treatment modalities, strategies in what's a constantly evolving theatre of treatment.
And the reason I passed that one to you, Tom, is I don't think it's our job as a company, so as the CEO of Synergen, to tell governments how they should be handling COVID. I think all we can do is create a treatment option. And, this is looking like a very exciting option to give to patients in hospital. We're really fortunate as a company to have data from last year that said that we should be directing this towards patients on hospital who are taking oxygen, and that's who we're recruiting into our phase 3 trial. And now we've got this potential line also that people outside of hospital who are very breathless might be another group to target with the drug. And in terms of strength of signal, we're just very, very happy. We were pleased with our data last year, and the effect size has got larger. So we're now seeing hazard ratios greater than 3 in favour of drug over placebo in patients who are breathless. And in the context of the hospitalised patient, I haven't seen other effect sizes, and we just need to deliver that from a larger clinical trial, which is exactly what we're doing. So I think we're slightly beyond the time we had scheduled now, and I know that Tom and Nick have got to rush to do other things. So I can imagine that there are many questions that have been submitted in writing, and we'll do our best to respond to those questions over the next few days. I'd just like to say thanks to Nick and to Tom and everybody who worked on not just the hospital trial last year, but also the home trial. And it was a very novel trial design, and it took some innovative thinking to be able to deliver the drug to a patient's home, start them on therapy, doing everything remotely via Zoom or Teams calls. And it's worked out very well for us. And although not many people became ill, the whole data set has given us a very clear steer on who should be treated with this drug. And we're very pleased, and it increases our confidence that the phase 3 trial is going to read out positively in the second half of this year. So we'll stop the call now.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everyone. That does conclude your call for today. You may now disconnect. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of the day.